Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I'm here with Kyle Alander and Daniel Vecchio. Both of these men have been on my channel before. Kyle has a great YouTube channel, and Daniel, you have a blog, Vexing Questions, if I recall properly. So,
That's right.
if you all want to check out the work of Kyle and Daniel, you can go check out Kyle's YouTube channel. You changed the name, right, Kyle?
No, I didn't. I changed the profile picture,
All
so
right.
it's not. Yeah, but it's the same name. It's Christian Idealism. Right now I kind of took a break from my YouTube channel, but I'm still like in other parts of the internet doing research and stuff. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, instead of doing like a long introduction, we're just going to get right to the point because we do have time constraints. Let me just make a few comments before we start, and then I'll let Kyle and Daniel take it from here. The first thing I want to say is that this is for any context that people are interested in. I gave the new Eliakim argument for the papacy, had some help from Joe Schmid, and then eventually I gave an updated version on my channel later with Pat Flynn. And then Jeremy Kidd and John Cranman responded to the updated version of the new Eliakim argument. And so now Kyle and Daniel are responding to at least one part of their argument, which is kind of how the Bayesian objections and arguments are going to work in the course of the debate. I should also say here that um, I'm aware of things like the Moses Jeremiah objection that has been raised by the video. Unfortunately, due to being in graduate school, I didn't have a lot of time to like look and give my full comments. But from what I've seen so far, I do have like answers that I could give to those objections. But seeing as time is limited and I want to like sit down longer before I really like give a response, I'm just going to say I do have a response, but I'm not going to present it here today. So really, this video is about the Bayesian machinery, and I want to put that out there. So with that being out of the way, then Kyle and Daniel, I'll let you take it from here.
All right. Can the audience see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure. All right. So there is an important objection which I want to address, and it is relevant to dueling probabilities, but as we'll get to the objection, it has to do with the uncertainty theorem. We'll get near to that near the end of the presentation. But a big part of Suan's argument has to do with epicenter probability. So I'm going to go over here how do epicenter probabilities work, what is a dwindling probability, and then we're going to look at a case of how dwindling probabilities might work in natural theology. So specifically, we're going to look at the resurrection as a case study, and we're going to be looking more deeply into Richard Swinburne's work in regards to that. And then we're going to give what would be a dwindling probability objection to the new Eliakim argument, and then me and Daniel will respond to that objection when we get there. So first, how do epicenter probabilities work? So epicenter probability is the degree to which one proposition makes another likely. So there's kind of two types of epicenter probability. There's what's called non-basic probabilities, and these probabilities are just determined by the values of other probabilities. And then you have what's called basic probabilities, which is the elementary quantities out of which other probabilities are built. They are the atoms of probability theory. Now, when I'm talking about probability, I'm talking about an epistemic account. So I'm not focusing on the purely statistical notion, because on an epistemic account of probability, we're talking about what's called degrees of belief or degrees of support, which I'll get into in a minute. Because when it comes to probability, anything that satisfies Kolmogor's axioms can be considered probability. It's just that not all probabilities can be termed in terms of degrees of belief or degrees of support. So I just want to make that clear that I'm talking purely as an epistemic account, not about in regards to just any probability whatsoever. So how do I view epistemic probabilities? Well, I view probabilities as mind-independent support relations between propositions. The probability of A conditional on B is the degree to which B supports A, and the unconditional probability of A as to the degree which A is supported by a priori truths or tautologies. So when it comes to how we understand evidence, at least under this view of epistemic probability, we say that evidence is E is evidence for H if and only if the probability of H conditional on E is greater than the probability of H by itself. That is, if and only if E, or our evidence, raises the probability of the hypothesis above what it was when E, or the evidence, was not taken into account. And I just want to mention this here because when it comes to evidence, evidence does not have to be something that's only scientific or only historical. Evidence just needs to increase probability. That's it. Right. So I just want to make that point clear when we're talking about epistemic probabilities and what is considered evidence. And that'll be relevant, of course, for Suan's argument, which we'll get into, but I just want to make that clear. Another thing I want to make clear in regards to how we understand our background evidence. So there's kind of two ways you can look at background evidence. The first way is what I would term the sequential view. So in this case, we gather evidence sequentially, and so our background knowledge is really just our background evidence or evidence that we gathered before we look at some later sequential data. So here we have our background evidence, and then we have some newly discovered evidence, which is E4 in this case. And then this line right here, this arrow just represents like the time it took to discover each piece of evidence. The other kind of way you can look at our background evidence is really the holistic view. And so in this view, you could say that the causes or entities invoked by an explanation are similar to those causes or entities that are taken to exist within other neighboring, I call it clusters of evidence. And that's just because I actually think that all the different fields of studies, so like science, history, forensic studies, all that stuff are really, I mean, it seems like to me at least that they're really just different clusters of evidence. Like they're just asking different questions, and we gather evidence based in the or whatever's relevant in those fields, right? And so really, when it comes to fields of study, those are really just different clusters of evidence, and we come up with different hypotheses to account for them. But at the end of the day, I mean, these two views are not really in tension, right? So like, you know, we try to gather evidence, you know, as we do more research, and then we have different fields of study to kind of contextualize that evidence in a way, right? So when we understand this, we can view evidence as just simply our background evidence or our background knowledge of the world, right? And throughout the presentation, I just want to mention that this will be our K variable, because I'm going to be going over some very technical language as the presentation goes. Sorry, no one's talking. I just want to make sure I'm still connected. Okay, just making sure. All right. So now, what is a dwindling probability? So basically, a dwindling probability, and at least in this in an epistemic context, is basically where you make an additional claim, and you have no like independent evidence to support that. So one example you could say is that if we put all of our background evidence, like if we have all the evidence that we gather in the beginning, and then we add additional claims, well, logically, yeah, your probability is going to dwindle, right? So this is kind of one way you could represent it. So the probability of T or a theory conditional on K and E is greater than the probability of T and H and D conditional on K and E. So in this case, what you could say is that the probability of a conjunction of many conjuncts on some evidence is never greater than and is normally less than the probability of only some of those conjuncts on the same evidence. So that's basically what a dwindling probability is. Basically, the more claims you make and the less, like if you make the more claims you make, and if you don't increase your evidence as you're making those additional claims, the less probable it becomes. Like that's basically the idea behind a dwindling probability. So I hope
and there's going to be a lot of factors that kind of impact that, right, Kyle? Like
yeah,
how independent or dependent those claims are on one another.
Yeah, and I'll get into that because that is going to be relevant for Suan's argument. Hold on. But that's basically the idea. And I mean, yeah, I agree. Like, okay, if you're gonna make more and more claims and you don't add evidence, if you don't update your, theory or whatever, then yeah, you're gonna dwindle probability. And I'll get into some ways you can kind of get around this whole dwindling probability objection, but that's basically what it is in a nutshell. So now we're going to look into what is an example of a dwindling probability in natural theology. So I'm going to look at one case study, which is what I call Christian revelation. So this is from Richard Swinburne's book called Revelation. So I'm going to be basically quoting Richard Swinburne through most of this now. And so he says, the objection from dwindling probabilities is the name given by Alvin Plantinga on what he sees as a major difficulty in the way of producing cogent historical arguments for the truth of the central elements of Christian doctrine. Have this be, well, let's just call it G, or G variable. In order to pursue ramified natural theology, Plantinga claims correctly we need first a bare natural theology to argue for the existence of God T on the basis of all our background knowledge K, the totality of what we know apart from theism. And Plantinga seems to acknowledge that arguments from background knowledge accepted by theists and atheists alike will be probabilistic. They will show that there is some probability on that evidence that there is a God, probability T conditional on K, or we could just have K just, again, be all of our kind of background evidence. Now, of course, Swinburne has argued elsewhere, especially in his book on the existence of God, that the probability of God's existence is more probable than 50% or 0.5. However, Plantinga represents Swinburne's kind of style of argument. Basically, so like, yeah, you have theism, but then Christian theism is theism plus all these additional claims, right? And so what Plantinga does is he says, okay, we must consider the probability given T and K that A, God would make some kind of revelation to humankind. So in this case, you can have it be the probability of A, which is just this claim right here, be conditional on T and K. But then we need to argue that such revelation would contain G, or Christian revelation. So basically what Plantinga is trying to argue here is that we would need some reason to think that God would reveal some kind of revelation to mankind, and that revelation contains the Christian revelation specifically. Now, of course, as Plantinga wants to argue, this kind of builds up over time. Plantinga suggests that one way to do this is to ask the probability of B, which we can say as Jesus's teachings were such and such that they could be sensibly interpreted and extrapolated to G, or Christian revelation, given our K variable, our T variable, so given theism, and then given the last claim we just made, which is that God would make some kind of revelation, right? And in this case, then you would need to argue that our B variable is probable given K and T and A. But of course, this is what Plantinga argues now, but he asks, why suppose that the teachings are true? Perhaps our background knowledge plus what has been established makes it probable that G, or not G, but C, which is that Jesus rose from the dead. In this case, we have, again, as we make more claims, we have to conditionalize the additional claim we're making on top of the other claims we're making. And so make it probable given that fact, so given the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, that D, in raising Jesus from the dead, God endorsed his teachings, right? So we need B to be true, C to be true, and D to be true. And so from there, then we can say, okay, well, how do we get to G then, right? But then we would have to also say that E, Jesus founded a church to interpret his teachings, and that the church which still exists. Sorry, I should have gone back and fixed that. But anyways,
still extent. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, still extent teaches G that God preserves it from error. And so basically, Swinburne, again, in this book, he's arguing that God would ensure that he creates a church, right? But then here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. And so this is what Plantinga says. So call the probability that God endorsed extrapolation of Jesus' teachings and given the previous evidence. In this case, we have E conditional, K and T and A and C and D, which is basically, we're just adding in all these additional claims, right? But then to get the probability that G is true, which is what really matters, which is in this case, just the Christian revelation, we need to this is what Plantinga wants to do. He wants to multiply everything, basically. So he wants to say, okay, in order to show that our G is true, we have to basically multiply everything. So we say, okay, based on our background knowledge, so our initial K, we must multiply everything together. So we have the probability of E conditional on K equal to the probability of T conditional on K times the first claim we made, which is A, that God makes some kind of revelation, conditionalize on that, times B, which is the second one, Jesus' teachings were such and such that they could be interpreted, which then we conditionalize on that, times again. Okay, so basically what Plantinga's arguing is like, okay, we have to multiply all these claims together. And so he argues that since E entails G, so we could say our evidence, I think that's what yeah. So since E entails G, Plantinga seems to suppose that the probability of G, conditional on the probability of G and K, can be taken as tantamount to the probability of E conditional on K. However, at each stage of multiplication, there will be a diminution of probability. Each individual probability may be quite high, right? So even if we say, okay, there's 90% probability that A is true, there's 90% probability that B is true, there's 90% probability that C is true, there's 90, 90, 90 all throughout, right? Well, when we multiply it together, we actually get a resulting probability of 0.35, right? And then that is true, right? If we multiply everything together, if we multiply all these claims together, then yeah, you're going to get a diminished probability, right? And so Plantinga argues that the attempt to establish G on the basis of historical argument cannot give a very high probability, not at all the kind of probability we need if we are to know the great truths of the gospel. So basically that is the objection to, or that is Plantinga's objection to Swinburne, at least in terms of trying to argue for Christian theism on history. Is there any questions about how exactly his argument works, or should I continue?
Yeah, you should continue. Although maybe I'll just say one thing really quick. I mean, if this is how Swinburne is running the argument, then it just mathematically follows that this results, right? So it's not like, somehow Plantinga has, messed with mathematics here. It's like, no, if this is how Swinburne has structured the argument, then he is in trouble.
Yeah. And I mean, I agree, right? But that's not how he structures it. And this is where he gives his response.
Well, can I just interject one
ahead.
thing, and that is structuring an argument isn't the same as how the argument itself exists in its entirety. So even if you structure an argument a certain way, right? In other words, it might be that you're making a series of conditional claims, and then you could interpret it this way, and then you say, oh, well, the result is dwindling probabilities. But that might not be the full entirety of what, and maybe we're saying the same thing, but
yeah,
the entirety of what Swinburne's doing is not merely a bunch of conditional claims. Anyways, go on.
Yeah. So this is where he gives his response, and I'll just summarize Plantinga's argument again, and then we'll get into what Swinburne has to say. And so, of course, Plantinga resultant's value assess the probability in K on the whole conjunction. So he's taking the initial evidence that we gather, and then he multiplies all the additional claims together, right? And so it's true, like by the theorem of the probability calculus, it will inevitably, or the probability will inevitably be less than the probability of any lesser number of the conjuncts in the same evidence, right? So the more claims we make, basically, the more likely we are to make a mistake, right? And that is true. That is certainly true. But this is not how Swinburne, of course, structures his argument. So Swinburne provides kind of two responses. The first response is that basically, well, first of all, we can, and I'll get more into details later about this, but insofar as the dwindling probabilities go, it applies in every, like, this isn't just true of Swinburne's argument, this applies to any field of study, right? But just because there are things in history and science where there's a lot of different claims being made, that doesn't mean that the conclusions are not very probable. And I'll get into the reasons why. And then the second response that Swinburne kind of gives is basically that the dwindling probabilities only arises because Plantinga supposes that all the evidence is put on the table at the beginning, right? But if we can add in evidence gradually, as Swinburne does in his work, that's not really a problem, and I'll get more into that. But So the first thing I want to say in regards, or this is what someone where it says, and I kind of broke it down a little bit. But dwindling probability only works if each proposition is independent, right? So consider, let's just take, for example, consider a single page of a serious work of history, right? Let's take Julius Caesar as an example, right? Let's say that on the same evidence, the first proposition in that document, so like we're looking at, let's say we're reading about the life of Julius Caesar, and there's one proposition, like let's just say there's one proposition in the very beginning, right? It is true that, yeah, the first proposition is going to be more probable than the conjunction of everything in that document that we discover, right? In fact, it's going to be, the more claims it makes, the less probable it's going to become. However, again, this assumes that each proposition is independent, right? It will certainly be less on the same evidence than the probability that the first one is true. But whatever the difference is, significant or not, depends on what the evidence is and what the historical propositions are and how well they fit together, or we can call it their propositional dependence, right? So this is the kind of the first problem with dwindling probabilities, is that if the author uses some of the propositions as evidence for others, then again, the formal proposition will be more probable than the conjunction of the others. But again, everything depends on the details, right? And so how the evidence fits together in which way will depend on the propositions and will determine how much the probabilities dwindle. And so even if all things being equal, the probability of T conditional on T and K and E is greater than the probability of T and H and D conditional on K and E, if the propositions are dependent on each other, we can say that our evidence, so the evidence that we gather, informs us about these additional claims, right? And so since the propositions in the document all connect with one another, right? Let's just take up Julius Caesar. Well, I mean, it seems kind of weird to say, oh, only this little part right here in this document is that's the most probable and everything else is kind of not probable. No, because the evidence actually supports the entire document in and of itself, right? So because the propositions are dependent, then you're not going to lose overall probability. So
it's kind of like if you're reading in the document that he crossed the Rubicon and then went on to conquer Rome, and you're going to say, well, there's a probability that he crossed the Rubicon, but really you're reading it in the same document and it's all part of the same narrative.
Yep.
And so, dicing these things up as independent propositions and assigning values to them, it kind of gives the misimpression of how we would truly cast the epistemic probabilities. So go on.
So that's a kind of simpler way. I think that's a really like top level way of saying it, is like, okay, if I find this document and it tells me a narrative, well, if I know that the document's reliable, if I have good evidence for it, it seems really weird to like assign individual probabilities to every single one and say, oh, the more claims you make, the less probable it is. Like, no, you're using the same evidence, right?
Yeah. Maybe if I could see if I have the right idea, it'd be like, for example, let's say that I'm right 99% of the time, and I make 3 claims, right? And I'm 99% of the time right. So I don't know whatever 3 claims they are. Like, I don't know, it's going to rain tomorrow at this time. I'm going to enter this taxi at this time, and I will wash my hair with this shampoo tomorrow. Whatever. I make those 3 claims. It's like, but given the fact that I am 99% reliable, you wouldn't then look at each of the claims individually and then kind of look at them apart from me and then just multiply it, because then it would just dwindle down. You would take into account that it's all coming from this one source that is giving these 3 claims, but they are connected to each other.
Yeah, and they're all connected to each other. And that's, this is a whole different discussion, but that's why I don't like it when people object to Catholicism on the basis that it makes a bunch of claims. Because the claims that Catholicism makes about its dogmas are all dependent, right? Or at least not most of them are. There's going to be some of them like that might be, you can assess them individually, but most of the doctrines in Catholicism are dependent propositions, right? So you don't need to like independently assess every single. You just need to establish that the church is, if you have good reason to think that the church is infallible, then it doesn't really matter what the church declares as authoritative or not, right? So I just want to mention that as side note, but yeah. And so okay, yeah, sorry, I can't see the top part of on my end. So the second response that Swinburne gives to Plantinga on this point is that dwindling probability really only arises from the fact that that again, you're not able to update, right? And so the force of the evidence that Swinburne gives could be better appreciated if we not put all of our evidence there in the beginning, but rather as we add more claims, we can also add a new piece of evidence to support that claim, right? And if we do this, then in fact the probability actually increases, right? It doesn't decrease at all. So like the probability of P and Q conditional on R and S may be greater or less than the probability of P conditional on R, but it all depends on what those claims are. So it depends on the conjux of the hypothesis and the evidence, right? And Swinburne's overall methodology is precisely this. He basically gathers evidence sequentially, right? So he starts off with bare theism. He starts off arguing that God exists, or at least that there is a being that's all powerful and all good, right? That's what he does in the existence of God. Then if you read Swinburne's other works, he argues that the prior probability of Christian theism, or at least the prior probability of the resurrection of Jesus, is not high, but moderately high. So basically he gives reasons or a priori reasons to expect not that God would present some kind of propositional revelation to mankind, that those propositions are in connection with an atoning incarnation, and that, well, he basically argues number one, incarnation, atonement, and then and then the resurrection, or at least the prior, that there is a good reason why Jesus would rise from the dead, just independently of the historical evidence, right? So he makes that connection between bare theism and then some kind of Christian theism, right? So that's what he does in, it's called The Resurrection of God Incarnate. And then he argues further that based on the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, that we actually do have good reason to believe that he rose from the dead. And then later on in his work, in his book Revelation, he argues for a kind of Catholic and Orthodox ecclesiology, where basically that you want to make that Jesus Christ would find a church or some kind of society, right, with an aim, and it has this kind of continuity. So like he gives a priori reasons for that, but he also gives historical evidence for that as well, that's actually what the Christian church did. So again, this is kind of like, but notice how, okay, you start off with bare theism. Okay, we've established that God exists. Then we go to prior probability of Christian theism, which is basically just the Christian revelation, or at least the resurrection, Jesus. And then we argue from the historical evidence that number 3 and number 4 are true. So notice how these are all, this new evidence we're gathering over time, right? And so if we do it this way, it would be completely absurd to say that the last proposition here is less probable than the first proposition. And the reason why is because as we go through the steps, we're adding new evidence, right? And this is exactly what Swinburne does in his work. If you just read it, you'll find like he's making, he's kind of, not only is he updating his arguments, but he's also adding in more and more evidence to support what he's saying in his work. So that's kind of the second way to kind of get around this dwindling probability issue. And so now I just want to also mention, just real quick, in The Resurrection of God Incarnate, Swinburne gives a more formal way to argue for this. So he argues that basically the probability of God's existence is like 0.5. So it's like 50%. But then he argues that, so basically he argues that an argument for the conjunction of the incarnate God of Jesus, and Jesus, I think it's, yeah, so he argues this in the resurrection of God incarnate. So he argues his resurrection from our background knowledge. So the main piece of evidence is number one, the testimony of eyewitnesses to the empty tomb, the post-resurrection appearances, and then just in this case, E2 would be the evidence that no other known prophet in human history led to the right kind of life, which ended in the right kind of way with a super miracle such as the resurrection, right? So taking E to represent all of our evidence and noting that D entails T, so the background knowledge again entails theism, or at least makes theism probable. Swinburne claims that the probability of T and H and D conditional on K and E is greater than the probability of just T and K. So basically what he's saying here is that Christian theism, even though Christian theism makes more claims, at the end of the day, it is more probable than just bare theism, right? And that's just because he's gathering more and more evidence. And thus, Swinburne's argument is not subject to the dwindling probabilities objection because the evidence is found in two separate stages. Of course, if Swinburne, so let's just step back and say, okay, yeah, if Swinburne added in all of his evidence in the beginning, right, and then made additional claims, then yeah, the probability of T conditional on K and E is going to be greater than T and H and D conditional on K and E, right? But that's not what he does, right? In the formalized argument of the resurrection of God incarnate, he kind of puts in, I'm not going to go over exactly what he puts in there, but what he basically argues is that he gives a very high probability to T and H and K and D conditional on K and E is correct, right? And that's just because he adds more evidence, right? So the dwindling probabilities is just completely irrelevant in that case. So yeah, I think that's, is that okay? Yeah, that's pretty much it for in regards to what Swinburne has done. But that's all I'll have to say, at least on this. But is there any questions or concerns about like how this whole thing works and why the dwindling probabilities doesn't work as an objection?
No, none for me. Daniel, Daniel, do you want to say something?
No, I think this is a good setup for where we're going next, so we can move on.
Okay, what time? Okay, oh, we got plenty of time. Okay.
Yeah.
I kind of
We'll
went
see
a
how it
little bit
goes.
too fast. Yeah.
It was brilliant. Very good.
Yeah. But yeah, so basically, again, like I said earlier, kind of two ways to address dwindling probabilities. Number one, you talk about the claims you're making in terms of propositional dependence. So that's one way. And then the other way is just to basically add more evidence as you're making more claims. And so that in that case, dwindling probabilities just doesn't work at all. So we're going to get into the dwindling probabilities objection to the to Suan's argument. So this is basically the objection in a nutshell. Any uncertainty in a deductive argument will accumulate. Now, I put the uncertainty theorem here. I'm not going to pronounce what it says. But basically, the idea behind the uncertainty theorem is that in deductive arguments, any certainty that you put into the premises, you get out of the conclusion. And the same thing applies the other way around. So any uncertainty you put into a premise, you get in the conclusion, right? And so even if we say, okay, I'm going to grant a 70% confident in just two premises, right? Let's say I have a two premise argument with a conclusion. If I'm only granting 70% confidence, then yeah, though that uncertainty is going to accumulate to 0.6, right? So in that case, the probability that the conclusion is true is actually 0.4, so it's actually less likely. And you can just do this for any number, right? So if we put 90% confidence, we're going to, and let's say we have, again, 2 or 3 premises in an argument, you're still going to have that uncertainty. And that's just because of the fact, like, that's how deductive argument works. Any time you make a deductive argument, it's either true or false. So anything you put into the argument, you get out of the argument. So if you put in certainty, you get certain number certainty. If you put in uncertainty, you also get uncertainty at the conclusion. So So yeah, I hope that makes sense. And basically the objection is that Suan's argument falls into this problem.
Mhm.
Daniel, did you want to start to
Yeah.
work on? Okay.
So yeah, just if you go to that next slide. So the way Jeremy develops this argument is to use the example of the die argument as an analog. And so he says, imagine the scenario where I suppose you're reporting that the fair six-sided die I just rolled did not land on six. And so there's a sort of 1 in 6 probability there that's an accurate representation. And then he works through that for each sequential claim here, right? So 12 through 14 then are sort of premises. And so then what is the probability that the fair six-sided die I just rolled landed on 1 or 2? And the uncertainty there would just accumulate, right? So you just sort of add that all up, and it seems like actually the conclusion is not very likely, even though it follows deductively from the premises, simply sort of through an elimination, right? And then what you're left with is 1 or 2 as the possibility. So if you go to the next slide, I think, and I'm going to ask you to bounce back and forth a little bit. Yeah, so then they apply this to the Eliakim typological argument. And they say they're making some of the deductive inferences explicit here. So I grabbed this from their presentation and give them credit for developing it. So you're going to see that there are several premises, but also some inferences here. The premises I'd like to highlight are 1, 2, 4, and then 6 and 7. They add a few what they call implied premises, and I'm going to quibble over that a little bit. But if you move to the next slide, they then make a final assessment by assigning some uncertainties. I think they gave you some credit here, Suan, maybe just for the sake of argument, that you were able to establish some of these claims with 70% sufficiency. But then when you accumulate the uncertainty, so 70% would be 30% uncertain for premise 1, 2, and what they call premise 5, I'm going to take a little issue with that in a moment, and then add those up. They get to, if you go to the next slide, I think. So then they say, well, 0.3 plus 0.3 plus 0.3 plus 0.1 is going to give you a 1, right? And so they conclude that it is uncertain that the conclusion follows from all of this, because they're going to say that it's no greater than 0% likely. So if you go to the next slide, I can sort of draw this out. So I said this is as if, and here I use the Kalam cosmological argument, they were to assign, a 0.3 uncertain about 0.3 to whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist with 0.3 uncertainty. And then notice 3 here is an implication, which they call a premise. And they also then, I'm saying they're doing something like this. They're assigning an uncertainty to 3, and then moving on to 4, maybe we put a 0.1, and then we add that all up, 0.3, 0.3, 0.3, 0.1 to get 1. And so uncertainty of the conclusion is less than or equal to about 100%. And that's to say the argument does not by itself give any probability greater than 0 to the conclusion. And that's how they explain it. However, the problem, this is a first problem that I detect with the argument, is that it's using an inference in part of the accumulation of uncertainty. And that can be fixed pretty easily by simply realizing that it should have been 1, 2, and 4 rather than 1, 2, and 5. If you go back to the previous slide, maybe 2, yeah, here we go. So there, 1, 2, and 4, it should have been. So 5 is not a key premise. It's an It's a deduction. Is that clear?
Yeah, so I was gonna say this as well because I mean any logic class will tell you, okay, if you don't ever object to the conclusion, you object to the premise, right? Uh, it seems kind of weird to say, oh, I'm going to say that the conclusion's false, but then not address any of the premises, right? Because the premises are there to support the right. The conclusion just follows from the premises. So if you want to attack the argument, you have to go after the premises. And premise 5,
It's not a premise.
It's not a premise. It's really said right
it's
there.
indicated by that the conclusion indicator word so,
Yeah.
which means it's really an inference that includes 3, which includes 1 and 2, right? So it's really, if you add the uncertainty of 5 to 1 and 2, you're kind of doing an illicit move. Is that clear? You're multiplying uncertainties, as it were, or adding together uncertainties that were already assessed.
It strikes me as maybe double counting. Would that be a fair description?
Yeah, double dipping or something.
It's definitely double counting, because what they're, I mean, see right here. So like S5 is not a premise, right?
And if you go back a slide, I'm sorry, the audience is probably getting frustrated, but just go back a slide. If you go back 1.
But
sorry.
Like
they do
I'm
the same here.
3.
Yeah, in what they insert a 9 and 10. Right, so the numberings, they're going from 7, then they go to 8, but they insert 9 and 10. 9 and 10 are not implied premises. These are inferences in a complete deduction, right? Conjunction is from 3 to 5, that's making a part of your deduction explicit, which you didn't do because you don't need to. You just really need to state your premises, and everyone else can work on the deduction for homework if they want. But so they did that, but then to label it a premise, 9 and 10 a premise, this is again follows deductively from 6 and 9 by conjunction. So they did two conjunctions, fine, but to call them premises is a little bit misleading. And I'm not, I understand that's a mistake. It's not a big deal. And really then we need to just assess the premises, which would be, and let me just say, it really is going to come down to here, 1, 2, 4, 6, and 7. But let me say something about 6 and 7, because I remember talking about this with you, Suan, when you were developing it. And 6 and 7 are really attempts to model what is happening in the Bayesian analysis. Kyle, does that make sense? So it was an attempt to explain, without doing Bayes in a presentation, that this sort of evidence is going to have an effect on the hypothesis. So rather than just plugging it in and doing it through Bayes, Suan was doing a shorthand deduction for the sake of presentation, really. Okay, we can move on then.
Okay.
All right, keep going. So so this is my point. Really, you just add the uncertainties of 1 and 2 in this Kalam version, so that the subconclusion 3, the first stage cosmological argument, would have an uncertainty of 0.6, say, and then you could move on, add your uncertainty of the second stage. I'm just assigning a number, 0.1, whatever.
Yeah.
And then you would get a very different number from 1. It would be a 0.7. A little bit of a difference there. And that's why this is maybe a quibble, but it does. We do want to take care to represent Suan's argument accurately, and it will affect, especially if you're making a very strong case about how uncertain something is. You want to make sure you are distinguishing premises from conclusions, or subconclusions, or deductive implications. That was one point I wanted to make. If you move on, here's really the issue, as I think Kyle and I would put it. They're drawing on McGrew and DePauw's excellent paper. So we went through it when we looked at it, and what it's saying is the underlying assumption in I think Kidd is that if an argument is framed as a deductively valid argument, then the probability of the conclusion reduces to the lower bound. That's what, I'm sorry, McGrew and DePoe are saying. But Kidd is treating that uncertainty as if that's the only relevant number, right? So here's the quote. Although it is possible to cobble together a deductively valid argument from any evidence, sorry, let me have to move this, any evidence for any logically consistent conclusion by adding additional conditional premises, such deductive constructions generally do not represent well the relevance of the individual pieces of evidence to the argument. In other words, what I think McGrew and DePoe are saying is that the way you structure an argument is going to have different virtues, explanatory virtues, right? So if you, there's a reason William Lane Craig will get up in front of an audience and present an argument as a three-step syllogism. Why? It's very clear and easy to follow. Alternatively, we just saw Kyle brilliantly go through some of Swinburne's research, and it's quite difficult to wrap our minds around all those probabilities given this and that. It's just harder. So you're not going to gain any traction with an audience. So we could represent an argument in about a dozen or so different logical systems, right? We could have done it as an Aristotelian categorical syllogism if we wanted. We could represent it as a propositional argument, predicate logic, modal logic, whatever. It doesn't matter. But they're all going to have different features, different strengths and weaknesses, right? So you could do it in a Bayesian style. That's going to give you some, I think, the context in which we've been discussing your argument. But you presented it deductively for the sake of the audience, which I think was a wise move because it communicates it well. And it shows that indeed these implications do validly lead to a conclusion. But it does lose something. The weakness is it doesn't show the relevance of the individual pieces of evidence of the argument. And so what you were doing in your presentation, Suan, if I can speak on your behalf, is you were contextualizing the individual pieces of evidence through your presentation. I don't know if Kyle wants to jump in with anything on that.
No, I was just going to say that, yeah, I think a simple deductive argument is always going to be much easier to understand than a Bayesian argument. That's just because it's easy to follow. And I think Suan did a good job of, he made the right move of presenting it as a simple deductive argument. But I mean, even the premise, a lot of the premises themselves make it explicitly clear that this is a Bayesian argument, even if it's presented in a deductive form, right? So I think it's very unfair to, attack an argument like Suan's if the premises explicitly are using Bayesian terms, right?
Right, and they admit that in their own analysis. They do say this is a Bayesian argument. So they're acknowledging that Bayes is in the background, motivating these premises. So appeal to the uncertainty principle, therefore, should be met with caution because there's an upper bound, right? There's not just this lower bound. So, quote, the uncertainty theorem sets a lower bound on the probability of a conclusion of a simple deductively valid argument, given the probabilities of its premises without setting an upper bound. An argument may have many premises with high uncertainty and yet have a very probable conclusion, right? So if you cast the argument as a simple deduction with independent premises, then yeah, you're going to fall into this dwindling probability objection very quickly. And especially when you start assigning epistemic values to the certainty of each premise, you're just going to, that's a sort of natural way of seeing how this wouldn't work out, right? And the same thing has been applied to Kalam. It's been applied to Richard Swinburne by Plantinga. So it's not unexpected that this might happen to you, Suan. You're in good company, right? But we want to clarify and clear the air. So the second point, framing an argument in a deductively valid way is only to model it according to the virtues that a deductively valid argument that deductively valid arguments have. And I've said that before. It does not imply the argument must be exclusively understood as a simple deductive argument. And indeed, we know that you were talking in Bayesian terms. So if we go to the next slide, So this is a little calculator that Kyle and I've been working on here to kind of explain how this basic, because it's easier as a deduction, but it's hard to really capture what's going on with updating, especially in kind of real time. So we have these different fields that you can fill. They're indicated in the neon green color. And this will eventually feed out, the output here is in yellow, the posterior probability of the doctrine of the papacy given Eliakim and Peter typology. Now, there's a few things I want to say about this in terms of what that typology is, so that we can properly assess the numbers we're feeding into it. The typology here, which I think we have up here in this screen, is equal to Peter is the typological fulfillment of Eliakim in holding a supreme successive prime ministerial office under a Davidic monarch. This is a very specified typology, right? So this isn't just saying Peter is like Eliakim in preferring, I don't know, pomegranates to grapes, right? It's a very specified way in which they are alike, in which one fulfills the other. And I believe you had a very specified doctrine of the papacy in your argument. I don't recall at the top of my head, but we can assume it's something roughly what Catholicism asserts, that there's a apostolic succession from the office of Peter, of someone who has supremacy and universal jurisdiction over the Pope, over the church, right? And did you include infallibility in that or not? I can't recall.
Yeah, infallibility is part of the definition.
Okay, right. So basically, we can start by playing around with some of these numbers. I started off with some very modest, I believe, assumptions, and I'll sort of explain them. And maybe here Kyle can also talk about indifference, right? Because I think you mentioned that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you can go first. And
oh, well, I was just going to say I put in 10% likely that the papacy is
yeah,
true.
so I think when it comes to the prior probability, the way that I would start off, so independent of any, if we don't have any evidence for or against the papacy, I would put the prior at 0.33. Now, the reason why that's the case is I would apply what's called the indifference principle. So on the indifference principle, if you have no information about whether a hypothesis, like whether there's for or evidence against a hypothesis, then basically what you do is you take all the possible hypotheses that are on the table and then you assign equal probability to all of them. So like that's why it's called indifference, right? Because the probabilities are indifferent in that case. And so what we have here is we have Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Protestantism, right? And so you can represent these three branches of Christianity as different hypotheses about the papacy, right? And so because Roman Catholicism occupies one of those, the 1-3, then the prior probability, I would say, independent of any evidence, is going to be 33%.
So we could plug that in just for fun, and you can see it will affect the total probability of the posterior probability for the papacy, pushing it up over 90%. But of course, I was willing to put it a little lower in case somebody's coming at it having read some articles by Jerry Walls, or maybe they've also have to consider other reasons to think the papacy is true. They're going to come into it with their own background, and we're calling it a prior probability, but it's really prior to assessing your argument. So that's going to be different for everyone, right?
Yeah.
So someone can play around with this, but basically you do have to be somewhat open to the papacy being true in order for this argument to get off the ground. Let's just say that.
Yeah, as long as the prior is not 0, then the argument should get off the ground at least somewhat.
Right. So we can see that if we put this in at 0, what happens? Oh no.
Yeah, you can't even. Yeah, if it's 0, it's there's no way.
We have a fail. So again, if you put it in 0.001, something like that, it's not going to be very likely. So you do have to be somewhat open to the papacy on just general grounds, and say you said a 25%, 1 in 4, something like that. You can see you don't have to be convinced of the papacy coming into this argument to believe it's true. All right, but let's go down to the other side of this argument. And this is really, I think this is an interesting point. So we wanted to consider how much Suan's efforts really would affect this argument. And what I mean by your efforts, I mean talking about textual illusion, right? I said estimating based on known data points, including alternative typologies, but in light of Suan's case of textual appraisal, natural substitution, significant correspondence, divine approval, and authorial motivation. Those were the points you brought out. And let's say you did a grand job and got us up to 30%. It's not really that high, Suan. No offense, okay? Nonetheless, this is still a very powerful argument. Why? So it really comes down to these other two values. All right. And, we could play around with it. Maybe you're more convinced. I actually think Suan did, but I'm biased, right? I'm a Catholic. So I think you did a swell job, and I would put it much higher than 30% or whatever. But here's some interesting other probabilities to consider, which is the prior probability of the doctrine of the papacy given the typology. So without really even considering anything you've said, in other words, if we assume it is true for the sake of this probability, 100% certain that we have this particular typology, that, as John Cranman, I believe, said, is so close to the papacy that there's an identity of almost all of the attributes transferring from one to the other, then how likely is it that the papacy would be true? I put it at 0.5, 50%. It's got to be higher than that, to be quite honest. Because if you're going to say that Suan's typology specified is almost a perfect transfer, and that includes succession, right? We talked about that in previous videos. We talked about how Eliakim's place in the kingdom would have been directly under the king, especially given the context of the verse itself, whether or not historically that was always the case for every steward. So what we would say is that, if we gave a value, say a 0.6, say even higher, you can see that that does start to push things up. But it's this one that I think really becomes interesting.
That's the most important one.
Yeah, this is the prior conditional probability of the doctrine of the papacy, given that it's false, that there is such typology. In other words, there is no such typology. So it is not the case, right, that we have such typology. Then how likely is it that we're going to have a doctrine of the papacy? And we're giving that a very low value.
Now, I want to add something about this, because I think that's the most important part of the Bayesian argument, or the Bayesian analysis, which is basically the conditional probability of that the papacy is false, given the truth of this typology.
I think I misspoke just then, didn't I?
You did. Yeah, you're fine.
Sorry.
But what I was going to say about this, because some people might say, why are you guys putting it so low? Well, again, we're asking how likely is it that our hypothesis is that the papacy is false. How likely is it that we're going to find this kind of typology that on the hypothesis that the papacy is false? That's what we're asking, and the answer is pretty obvious. It's going to be very low, because there's no connection between the data, assuming this typology is true, and the hypothesis in question, right? Because in order for a hypothesis to actually make a prediction, you have to show how that hypothesis, what's the linking structure between your hypothesis and that data. It just seems completely absurd to say that, I would expect a high conditional probability that I would find this typology, given that the papacy is false. especially the typology that we're talking about, because they seem to try to want to argue, at least in the beginning part of the video, that that actually the conditional probability, I mean, they didn't say this explicitly, but basically the conditional probability is actually not that low. It's actually quite high. So, right. So they try to present this underdetermination objection. But I think here, when we're more specific about the typology we're talking about, that objection isn't going to really work. I don't know if you want to say
that
anything about that.
objection, sorry, yeah, Kyle, that objection really depends on an equivocal use of the typology, right? So you have to have a very expansive and fluid notion of what typology is to say, oh well, maybe the papacy is false, but Eliakim and Peter still both like grapes and don't like pomegranates, right? Or whatever they want to say the comparison is. Well, okay, but in this argument, it's very specific. Now, granted, and I think this is in all fairness, I don't know if Kyle would agree, but I think the more specific we are about the typology, the less certain we are going to be about this number up here on line 15, right? Because Suan's going to have to do the heavy lifting there. And that's what I think you were doing, right? That's why I think you detected in your argument, that's where all of the lifting has to come in from. The rest, which I think if you go back to those earlier slides, when I was talking about premises 6 and 7, are really just clarifying that this is what's going to happen once you have this. And really 1 and 2, your first two premises combining with 4, are really just different ways of talking about these probabilities here. Okay? So that's how I'm seeing the mapping on of this calculator here to your argument. So if we plug in different values, we can see how it affects. I mean, right here, we have a 25% chance that there's the papacy. I understand some anti-Catholic Christians are going to put that number very low. And this argument, sadly, is not for them. But if you're somewhat open to the possibility that, and here, the work of Joshua Sijuati might become relevant to such a person to raise that prior, that you might see some reason that Christ would want to institute a hierarchical structure. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so I think the prior probability of the papacy is just going to be whatever your background evidence says it's going to be, right? So like, for example, I don't know, I might be correct, I might be wrong on this, but Eric Hubar in his book, when I think it's called The Papacy, Revisiting the Catholic between Catholic and Orthodox. So I think there he says that the Catholic view is like, it's correct, but like a very slim margin. So like, I think he might, like, if you go from that perspective, you might put the prior at like 0.5 or 0.6 or something. And then you add this argument, well, then now your posterior is like 90. I don't know I mean, you can put it in right now if you want to.
What would you want me to put in?
Yeah, put in let's say it's like 0.55 or something for the prior. Right, very, very slim margin. So yeah, now with this argument, okay, now you can put a 93% posterior probability that the papacy is true, just given the numbers that we put on here.
And to be fair, there are arguments on the other side, the bad popes objection, the historical question around the monoepiscopy, but these are arguments for which there's responses as well, and so I think we have to just assess the evidence as best we can. So again, I would want to see this number. I mean, I would be willing to give you 50% on that, and you can see these numbers start to approach very high. It's actually very hard, unless you're willing to touch this one down here. And actually, I think 0.5% is generous. I mean, we were talking lower numbers before, but you can see.
I would, well, if you want, I can. So I would put like 0.002. That would be where I would put it. So just you put it in right now just to see. So yeah, that's where I would probably put the posterior probability at 99%. Like that would be my view on this. I mean, that's just from my perspective, but if, someone might have a different number. But yeah, I mean, the good thing about Bayes is that you don't have to stick to these numbers. You can change it around and see how much the evidence weighs and stuff. So
and that's what this calculator is kind of fun to play with, and you can see,
yeah.
okay, how am I feeling today? What have I read from Jerry Walls or from Eric Ibarra today, and how has that changed everything around on me? Now, ultimately, then, what I think this shows is that it properly construed, your argument does not really succumb to the dwindling probabilities objection. But that, I think it's really just going to come down to the beliefs you have coming in, and that's how I think it has to be assessed.
Well, I appreciate all the work you put into this. It's amazing. Yeah, I mean, as you guys have pointed out, I put a lot of hard work into the argument, and I always kind of sensed a lot of the things that you were saying in this presentation. I kind of sensed, like, I feel like you were pointing out things that I had been thinking, but I didn't really know how to express it because I'm not well versed in a lot of the nitty gritty of the Bayesian argumentation and calculations. But like, I intentionally did structure the argument in a way where it's Bayesian, but you can see with the deductive way that it's written out that you can clearly see where each step is falling from the other to get to where the conclusion is. And so I appreciate you just kind of helping me figure out how to phrase and understand my own argument in like terms that are more precise. So I mean, no, it's great, and I'm very, it's like watching your own kid grow up. Like I kind of started this whole argument in a way, and I did a lot of the time and research and energy, and then to see what you guys have done with it, it really means a lot. So yeah, this is great. For the audience, if you could maybe just summarize overall your basic findings, and then that could, I think, would be a helpful way to end the episode.
Yeah, and kind of, I don't know if you want to start, but maybe you could also add something about what a P and C inductive argument are.
Yeah, so when I first kind of investigated this argument in detail, I first kind of took the opinion that it was a C inductive argument, which is basically it just increases the probability, but that's it. So it's not really, doesn't really do much in terms of like whether you should be like accept the papacy or not. But there is a difference between a C inductive and then a P inductive. So a P inductive argument is one where it actually increases it above 50%. And based on the research that I found, I've put in some really crazy numbers, and almost every single time, it's always been a P inductive like argument. So basically, it raises it above 50%. And so I would say it's a successful P inductive argument. Even so, again, even if it's not 99%, even if it's like 70% or something, that's still a P inductive argument, right? It's still above 50%. So, that's what I would say. I think this is a successful P inductive argument for the papacy.
And I would add that ultimately, I believe that such an argument can only take you so far. And I do believe God works through arguments, but ultimately, I think that initiation, that move of faith begins with the Holy Spirit and bringing someone into the fullness of truth, imparting the divine faith. So whether this is going to work for you, I would hope someone would approach this type of argument prayerfully. And I mean that sincerely.
I agree with you, Vecchio, because I mean, it's very rare, especially in the papacy debate, to actually find an argument like this good for either side. But yeah, I was honestly like kind of shocked at how strong the argument actually is once you get into the Bayesian details of it and how it works. So yeah, I would agree with you, Daniel, and Suan, like, or anyone that thinks that this argument should be taken seriously, which is, I think, if you are a Catholic or an undecided Protestant or Orthodox, like, and you think that that there's some merit to what Suan is doing here, then I think you should pray on it and play around the numbers and see what you get. and
I do-
also try to be fair as well, try to be, try to really think critically about what you want to put into it.
Yeah, it's a time you can be a little skeptical and play around with the numbers, and then honestly assess. Cut those numbers. Give a number and then ratchet back to see. Maybe I'll even be more skeptical than that and see what happens. It's sort of interesting. But then, listen to your presentation, see what you have to say about the illusion and the themes, and why Christ would be saying this of Peter right after Peter reveals through the Holy Spirit the nature of Christ as the Son of God. And then the other thing I would say, I did want to say is I wanted to give a shout out to Kalam Miller, who did a resurrection calculator based on Swinburne's work, I believe. And he sent that out a long time ago to me. And then I thought, well, I'll do that with the papacy. And so he sort of served as an inspiration for this little calculator here. But I want to thank both of you for the time to talk this argument. I think it's got legs. So,
Well, guys, this has been a great way to spend my afternoon with all of you, and especially with these two guys here. And so, once again, thank you so much for working on the calculator and the PowerPoint presentation. I wish that I could spend more time on this argument, but I'm busy with graduate school, and so we'll just see where that takes me. But guys, thank you for taking the time to do this.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.